How you going, guys? Welcome back to another video. On this one, I'll be sanding down all the epoxy primer to find where all the highs and lows are so I can start doing the repairs over these wide body flares. If you haven't seen my previous video where I put these in epoxy, there'll be a link in your top right hand corner. Go check that video out. They'll bring you up to speed to where we're at. Yeah, with that said, guys, I'm going to start by sanding these down with the Big Kid blocks, also with the 240 grit sandpaper. So I'm going to pull that off like that. Now, one thing that I mentioned in my previous video, if you saw that, I made mention about the black epoxy and why I chose black over white or grey. Now, there's a real important factor when it comes to sanding something down, especially when you're trying to find highs and low spots. Now, I find when sanding the black epoxy, all the high spots stay grey, but the low spots are really highlighted because they're black. So it is really easy to see where all your highs and lows are when sanding down a black epoxy primer. So look, I'm not after a real sharp straight line all the way around where the flare meets the guard. I kind of want it to just curve into the panel, like into the flare. So that's why I welded the flares on the way I did. If I was after a sharper line, I would have butt welded it all up. So yeah, we'll start sanding this down. Let's see how badly warped I got it. And yeah, we'll start on the repairs. All right, so when sanding down a panel, guys, you want to try and get yourself the most straightest, flattest, most rigid block that you can, which will help skim over the top and really highlight those highs and low spots. So for that, I've got these Big Kid blocks. I've used these on a few cars over the last probably 1 or 2 years, and I love them. They just work so well. So when it comes to blocking, guys, the way that you want to block is in an X shape like pattern. If you block in the same like direction for too long, you'll probably end up sanding a big line in the panel. Now, that's all well and good doing that on epoxy. You don't really need to get too fussy with sanding lines and blocking the epoxy straight, because you can always fix that in either the body filler or the HS primer, which gets applied over the top. So the way that I like to block epoxy is pretty much, as I said, in an X pattern. So that's what we'll do now. So you'll see there's quite a few like grind marks on the panel. It was actually really hard to sand those out with 80 grit and 180 because obviously we used 80 grit on a roll lock. Now, I'm not overly too worried about the grind marks at this stage. I'll be able to sand them all out before I put the HS primer on. So yeah, it's not a real big deal at the moment. So it's looking like I've got a bit of a low spot around where this indicator goes. So they'll be rather easy like to pull out. So we can almost do that just with a bit of a pull, I reckon. And the beauty about the black epoxy is that you can give it a bit of a pull round and give it another sand, and you'll be able to see if you've pulled it out enough. So we've pulled it out down the bottom. We've just got to come out a little bit here. You can use a slide hammer, but for something so flimsy like this, probably doesn't really need a slide hammer. You'll probably end up pulling it out too far. All right, so we've pulled that area out. So it's just this corner here, really. We're getting there. However, we're starting to sand through the epoxy. Now, it doesn't really matter too much if you sand through the epoxy in small areas, like on an edge, but I wouldn't be sanding too much of it off, because at the end of the day, touching base with what I've said in other videos, you don't want surface rust happening on the panel before you paint it. Rid of that tape. And look at that, we've pretty much got that all out just by giving it a bit of a pull. Still feels like there's a low spot there. And I think also the indicator will actually cover a lot of that area anyway. But yeah, there's a little dent just on the corner there. I don't really want to sand it too much because I don't want to sand too much of that epoxy off. But that's not too bad. We've got a couple of little tiny little dents up here. There's one there and a little dent here. Now, depending on how much epoxy primer you put down, determines whether you've got enough primer on there to sand a lot of these tiny, smaller dents out. There's no point putting bog on something if you can sand a lot of the damage out. So here you can see we've got a little low spot there. Now, primer, HS primer could probably fill that in, but I reckon we've got enough epoxy on the panel to sand that out. If we start seeing any sign of sanding through the epoxy down to the bare steel, I'll stop. So I'm just starting to sand through there now, so we'll stop. We got most of that out. I'll probably end up putting a little bit of filler there. So we've got a high spot there. We can probably tap that one down with the ball peen hammer. And just as a real fast look at this, as you can see here, we've got a low spot there, and that's why I love the black, because it just stands out. It's really, really good. In regards to the coats of epoxy, I did put about 5 coats of epoxy down. So I know there's going to be lots of product on here to sand off, which is really good. So I remember back when I was an apprentice, I always used to think, how do you know when to stop sanding? Well, pretty much when you paint anything, it doesn't matter if it's base coat, primer, or even like your clear coat, you're always going to get some form of orange peel on it. So what you want to basically do is just sand the orange peel out, and that should be plenty enough of sanding and leaving enough like epoxy primer on the surface. So when I was actually sanding all the grind marks out, because of the roll lock, it actually caused some really deep white grind marks. So I'm not overly worried if I can't sand those grind marks out, because I know the HS primer that I'm going to use over the top of this will actually fill all that in. And I'll probably put extra coats of primer over these areas anyway. So it's always a good idea to try and keep your block dead straight. And when you've got 2 different shapes, I guess, you'll see here, you end up getting a line, and that's a good indication that you've been keeping your block nice and straight. But yeah, so that area there looks pretty straight, very happy with that. Obviously we've got our low spot here. Now what I like to do, it's very much a process of thinking outside the box. So what I like to do, when I've got a bit of a curved area, I like to fold the sandpaper over. So what this will do is basically like create 2 blocks in one. It's all down to the technique in which you sand. Now, I'm hoping you'll be able to see this on camera, but the way that I sand curved areas, and look, I've got curved blocks, I can go and grab out of my toolbox and sand this area without much of a technique. But let's say you don't have a curved block and you've only got a straight block. What I like to do is kind of go in a cross hatch kind of pattern, but kind of curve the block up at the same time. And you'll find that if you're blocking in the right technique, you'll find that you can sand the area pretty flat. Ideally, a tubular block would have sanded that much easier, like heaps easier. But I just thought I'd show you that, look, you can block a curved area with a flat block. So I've got another low spot there showing up. What you're probably wondering is, well, okay, so you've sanded it down with 240. What about all the shiny areas? Now, there's a couple of different ways you can go about this. You can either use red Scotch Brite. Now, I'm not a big fan of putting body filler over the top of red Scotch Brite. I'm very much a believer of everything needs to be sanded with like sandpaper. And they say red Scotch Brite is equivalent to like 240, 180-ish. But I'd rather use sandpaper because at least it's causing a bit more of a scratch. So I'll just fold that sandpaper over and sand down in all the tight little grooves. If there's any areas like in the scratches from the grinder that I can't actually sand by hand, I'll just get some red Scotch Brite and do those tiny little areas. But I reckon that looks pretty decent. If you're wondering, right, if you're going to sand that by hand, aren't you worried that you're going to lose that area? Well, that's where another technique comes in, where if you keep your hand nice and flat on the panel, you can usually feel where all those highs and lows are. And that's, I guess, a skill which comes over time. It used to take me a long time to try and work out what was high and what was low. And it's just something that comes to you over a period, I guess. You get better at it, like the more you do it.